Well now, gather round, friends, and let this old voice paint you a picture of a time and a place etched deep in the heartwood of this country. We're heading out to the Arizona Territory, where the sun beats down like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, and the land itself is carved with canyons deep enough to swallow secrets whole. The dust out there, it ain't just dirt. It's the pulverized bones of hopes and dreams, kicked up by a wind that moans like a lost soul through the skeletal ribs of ancient saguaros. It's a place that demands grit, that tests a man's spirit down to the very bedrock. And sometimes, well, sometimes it finds a man wanting. This here's a story about a man like that. A man wearing a star meant to signify courage, but carrying a heart full of shadows. It's about fear, the kind that gnaws at you from the inside out, and the long, hard road a man might have to walk to finally face it down. The coffin lid closed with a dull, final thud that seemed to echo the emptiness in the pit of Sheriff Arthur Bishop's stomach. Dust, finer than flour, immediately began to settle on the raw pine, obscuring the grain, claiming it for the land. There weren't many folks gathered there on that wind-scoured patch of cemetery overlooking the town of Dust Devil Gulch. Just the preacher, mumbling words Arthur couldn't quite hear over the keening wind, Doc Evans looking grim, Sarah Jenkins standing ramrod straight, her face pale but tearless, and her young son Billy, clutching her hand, his eyes wide with a grief too big for his small frame. And Arthur. He stood a little apart, the silver star pinned to his vest feeling heavier than lead, catching the relentless sun in mocking glints. This was the third grave dug in as many months for a man who dared to stand against Jedediah Stone. This one belonged to Frank Jenkins, Sarah's husband. A good man, Frank. A small-time rancher with more backbone than sense, some said. He'd refused Stone's latest offer for his land, the parcel with the only reliable spring for miles around, besides the one Stone already controlled upriver. Frank had argued, threatened to go to the territorial capital, talked about water rights and prior claims. Then came the accident. A rock slide in the narrow pass leading to his upper pasture. Convenient. Too convenient. Just like the cattle rustling that plagued others who wouldn't sell, or the fences mysteriously cut, or the wells suddenly running dry. Arthur shifted his weight, the worn leather of his gun belt creaking. He hadn't investigated the rock slide too closely. He'd ridden out, looked at the tumble of boulders, listened to Stone's foreman, a hard case named Rourke, offer condolences smooth as river stones, and wrote it up as a natural occurrence. What else could he do? Jedediah Stone wasn't just a man. He was the shadow looming over Dust Devil Gulch. He owned the bank, the mercantile, run by a man wholly indebted to him, most of the valley's best grazing land, and most importantly, the water. He'd arrived 10 years back with a fortune of mysterious origin and systematically bought or squeezed out nearly everyone who stood in his path. His sprawling Double S Ranch headquarters was a fortress overlooking the town, a constant reminder of his power. He rarely came into the gulch himself anymore, preferring to send Rourke and his crew of rough-looking riders to handle his business. And Arthur Bishop, sheriff of Dust Devil Gulch, mostly just let them. He could feel Sarah Jenkins's eyes on him now, burning into the side of his face. He didn't dare meet her gaze. He knew what she thought of him, what most of the town thought. Sheriff Bishop, the man who looked the other way, the man whose star was tarnished not by corruption, but by cowardice. The word hung unspoken in the dry air between them, thick and suffocating as the dust. He swallowed, his throat tight. He hadn't always been this way. There was a time, back east, before the war, before Shiloh, before the screaming and the blood and the faces of the men he couldn't save, a time when the star might have fit better. But that man was buried deeper than Frank Jenkins ever would be. The war had hollowed something out of him, leaving behind a fear that settled in his bones, a constant, chilling awareness of his own inadequacy, his own mortality. He'd come west seeking anonymity, peace, a place where the ghosts wouldn't follow. He'd somehow ended up sheriff in this struggling town, pinned by a sense of duty he couldn't quite fulfill and a fear he couldn't outrun. The preacher finished his mumbled prayer. Doc Evans stepped forward, patted Sarah's shoulder awkwardly. Folks began to drift away, back towards the dusty collection of buildings that huddled in the valley below, leaving Sarah and Billy alone by the raw earth mound. Arthur knew he should say something, offer condolences, some empty platitude, but the words caught in his throat, tasting like ashes and self-disgust. He turned, his boots crunching on the dry, gravelly soil, and walked slowly back towards town, towards the small, dusty office that felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. The star on his chest seemed to pulse with heat, branding him not with authority, but with shame. Jedediah Stone had claimed another victim, and Sheriff Arthur Bishop hadn't lifted a finger. The wind howled through the pass, carrying the scent of dust and despair, and Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that it was whispering his name, calling him out for the coward he knew himself to be. Dust Devil Gulch wasn't much to look at, even on a good day. A single main street, rutted and uneven, lined with perhaps 20 buildings in various states of repair. The Oasis Saloon, owned by a nervous man named Flynn, who paid tribute to Stone for protection. Miller's Mercantile, where the prices climbed steadily higher as Stone squeezed the supply lines. Doc Evans's surgery, smelling perpetually of antiseptic and regret. The blacksmith's forge, ringing with a tired rhythm. Martha's boarding house, offering indifferent meals and lumpy beds. And the sheriff's office, a small clapboard building with peeling paint, a rickety boardwalk out front, and a single barred cell inside that rarely held anyone more dangerous than a Saturday night drunk. Arthur Bishop had drifted into the Gulch 5 years earlier, a quiet man with haunted eyes and a past he never spoke of. He kept to himself, worked odd jobs, drank moderately at the saloon, causing no trouble. When the previous sheriff, a crusty old-timer, had succumbed to a fever, the nascent town council, such as it was, already feeling Stone's influence, had looked around for a replacement. Arthur was quiet, literate, had served in the army, though he never elaborated, and crucially, seemed unlikely to challenge the established order, meaning Stone. They offered him the job, perhaps thinking a quiet man was better than no law at all, or perhaps because Stone himself subtly approved the choice, recognizing a man unlikely to cause him trouble. Arthur, adrift and lacking purpose, had accepted, maybe hoping the badge would force him to be the man he once was, or maybe just because it was something to do. The star hadn't transformed him. It had only highlighted his failings. He wasn't physically a coward, not in the usual sense. He could handle a rowdy cowboy, face down a drunk with a drawn weapon. He'd seen enough violence in the war that saloon brawls seemed almost trivial. His fear was deeper, more insidious. It was the fear of failure, the fear of making things worse, the fear of confrontation that might escalate beyond his control, dredging up the horrors he tried so hard to keep buried. And Jedediah Stone, with his quiet menace, his invisible network of power, his ruthless efficiency, Stone embodied that fear. Stone represented overwhelming force, the kind Arthur had seen shatter men on the battlefield. So Arthur practiced avoidance. He found reasons not to investigate Stone's activities too closely. He accepted flimsy explanations. He enforced the law selectively, focusing on petty crimes while the larger injustices festered. He told himself he was keeping the peace, preventing open conflict that the town couldn't possibly win. But deep down, he knew he was just afraid. His deputy, young Ben Miller, didn't understand. Miller was barely 20, full of youthful idealism and eager to prove himself. He saw the injustice, felt the town's frustration, and chafed under Arthur's cautious restraint. "Sheriff," Miller would say, his voice tight with frustration after another rancher reported cattle missing near Stone's boundary lines. "We gotta ride out there. We gotta face Rourke down." "And say what, Ben?" Arthur would reply wearily, polishing his spectacles, avoiding the younger man's earnest gaze. "Accuse him with no proof? Stone owns half the territory. His brand is on more cattle than anyone. You think any judge appointed by men he knows is going to listen to us over him?" "But it ain't right," Miller would insist. "Right and reality ain't always the same thing out here, son," Arthur would sigh. "Best we can do is keep folks from killing each other over small stuff. Stirring up Stone, that helps no one." Miller would fall silent, disappointment clear on his face, leaving Arthur feeling even smaller, more ashamed. The townspeople reflected Miller's frustration, though most were too afraid or too weary to voice it openly. They offered Arthur curt nods, averted gazes. Children sometimes whispered, "Scaredy sheriff," just loud enough for him to hear. Only Sarah Jenkins dared to confront him directly. After Frank's death, she'd stopped outside his office, her eyes blazing with grief and fury. "He's dead, Sheriff," she'd said, her voice low and trembling. "Frank's dead because he wouldn't bow down. And you did nothing. You just polished your badge while Stone's shadow swallowed this town whole. Does that star mean anything at all?" Her words struck him like a physical blow. He had no answer, just stood there mute as she turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the echo of her accusation and the heavy weight of his own cowardice. Jedediah Stone was the architect of this fear. He rarely needed overt violence anymore. The threat was usually enough. He operated through proxies, through legal maneuvers, through economic pressure. He dammed the upper reaches of Devil Creek, which fed the valley, diverting most of the water to his own vast acreage, leaving only a trickle for downstream ranches and the town itself during the dry season, which seemed to be getting longer every year. When ranchers couldn't water their stock or irrigate their small fields, their land became worthless. Stone would wait until they were desperate, then make an offer through his bank manager, a pallid man named Harrison, at rock-bottom prices. Refusal meant more trouble. Fences cut, hayricks mysteriously catching fire, loans suddenly called due. Frank Jenkins had been one of the last holdouts with decent water access. Now, only Miguel Ramirez, whose small farm lay adjacent to Jenkins's former property, stood between Stone and complete control of the valley's water south of his ranch. Ramirez was a quiet man, hard-working, with a wife and 3 young children. He'd inherited his small plot from his father and worked it tirelessly. He rarely came to town, keeping to himself, trying to remain invisible. But Arthur knew Stone wouldn't ignore that spring on the land bordering Ramirez's property, the spring Frank Jenkins had died defending. Ramirez was next. It was inevitable. Arthur sat in his office, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty window pane, illuminating dancing dust motes. He stared at the wanted posters tacked to the wall, faded images of men long gone, symbols of a justice he felt incapable of delivering here, in his own jurisdiction. He picked up the star from his desk where he'd dropped it after the funeral. It felt cold in his hand. Sarah Jenkins's words echoed in his ears. Does that star mean anything at all? He thought of Frank Jenkins in his fresh grave, of young Billy's bewildered eyes, of Miguel Ramirez tending his small field, unknowingly living on borrowed time. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, so intense it made him physically nauseous. He closed his eyes, seeing again the smoke and chaos of Shiloh, hearing the screams. Was he doomed to always be the man who stood by, paralyzed by fear while others suffered? He pinned the star back on his vest, the sharp point pricking his finger. A single drop of blood welled up, dark against the silver. It felt like an omen. The pressure was building, inside him and outside. Sooner or later, something had to break. The breaking point began as it often does, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding pressure. Jedediah Stone, having acquired the Jenkins place through a swift foreclosure handled by his bank, turned his attention fully to the remaining obstacle. Miguel Ramirez's small farm and its access to that vital spring near the property line. Stone didn't need Ramirez's land, not really. He needed absolute control of the water. The harassment started subtly. A few of Ramirez's chickens disappeared. Then a calf went missing. Miguel reported it to Sheriff Bishop, his face etched with worry. Arthur rode out, looked around, found no tracks leading off the property, and could do little more than offer sympathetic but ultimately useless words. "Keep a close eye, Miguel," Arthur advised lamely. "Maybe keep your stock closer to the house at night." Miguel just nodded silently, his dark eyes holding a weary understanding of the sheriff's helplessness. Then, Rourke and a couple of Stone's riders started making regular patrols along the fence line bordering Ramirez's property. They didn't trespass, not yet. They just watched. Their presence was a constant, low-level threat designed to unnerve. Young Deputy Miller saw them one day while making his rounds. "Sheriff, Rourke's men are practically camping on Ramirez's doorstep, he reported, bursting into the office. They're trying to spook him off. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. Are they on his land, Ben? Well, no, but are they threatening him directly? Not with words, maybe, but you can feel it. We gotta do something. They haven't broken any laws we can prove, Arthur said, the familiar excuse tasting like bile in his mouth. My hands are tied. Miller slammed his fist on the desk. Tied? Or you just keeping them in your pockets, Sheriff? He stormed out before Arthur could reply, the slam of the door echoing Arthur's own internal condemnation. The situation escalated when the trickle of water from Devil Creek that fed Ramirez's irrigation ditch slowed even further. Stone's men had clearly been tampering with the diversion gates upstream again, gradually choking off the supply. Ramirez's corn stalks began to wither under the relentless sun, the beans yellowing on the vine. Desperation began to creep into Ramirez's eyes when Arthur saw him next in town, buying meager supplies at Miller's Mercantile. Sheriff, Miguel pleaded, his voice low and strained, my crops, they are dying. Without the water, my family, we cannot survive the winter. Arthur felt a pang of genuine empathy, quickly followed by the cold grip of his own fear. What could he do? Ride up to Stone's ranch and demand he release more water? Rourke would laugh in his face, or worse. Go to the territorial courts? Stone had judges in his pocket, and the legal process would take months, long after Ramirez's crops, and likely his hope, had turned to dust. I'll talk to Harrison at the bank, Miguel, Arthur offered weakly. See if they can extend your credit. It was a useless gesture, and both men knew it. Harrison answered to Stone. Miguel looked down at his worn boots. Gracias, Sheriff, he murmured, devoid of hope. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. Arthur watched him go, the shame burning hotter than the Arizona sun. He saw Sarah Jenkins watching him from the doorway of her repaired store. She'd refused to sell the building, scraping by selling baked goods and mending. Her expression was one of cold contempt. He couldn't bear it. He turned abruptly and retreated into the dim sanctuary of his office. He poured himself a whiskey from the bottle he kept locked in his desk drawer, something he rarely did during the day. The liquor burned its way down, but it didn't warm the icy knot of fear in his gut. He was failing the town, failing Ramirez, failing himself. That night, sleep offered no escape. He dreamed of Shiloh, of mud and blood, of Frank Jenkins's face dissolving into dust, of Miguel Ramirez's children crying from hunger. He woke up in a cold sweat just before dawn, the silence of the town pressing in on him. He couldn't go on like this. The avoidance, the excuses, the slow erosion of his own soul, it was becoming unbearable. But the alternative, confronting Stone, that felt like leaping into an abyss. He was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at paperwork, when Deputy Miller rushed in again, his face pale, his breathing ragged. Sheriff, it's Ramirez, Rourke and his boys. They rode onto his place this morning. Said his fence was on Stone's property line. A lie. Everyone knows it. They started tearing it down. Miguel tried to stop them. They beat him, Sheriff. Beat him bad. Doc Evans is patching him up now, but they trampled his fields too. What was left of them? Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. Beaten? Fields trampled? This wasn't subtle harassment anymore. This was blatant, brutal intimidation. This crossed a line. His wife? His children? Arthur managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Scared half to death, but Rourke didn't touch them. Just made sure they watched, Miller said bitterly. Laughed while they did it. Said Stone sends his regards and expects the property vacated by the end of the week. Arthur stood up slowly, his legs feeling unsteady. He looked at Miller's furious, expectant face. He looked at the star on his own chest. He thought of Miguel Ramirez, beaten and broken, his livelihood destroyed. He thought of Sarah Jenkins's accusing eyes. He thought of the promises unspoken when he first pinned on that badge. The abyss yawned before him. He could step back, find another excuse, write another useless report, or he could finally step forward. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but for the first time it was overshadowed by something else. A profound, soul-deep weariness of his own cowardice, and a flicker, faint but insistent, of long-dormant anger. "All right, Ben," Arthur said, his voice quiet but different, harder somehow. "Saddle up. We're paying Mr. Rourke a visit." Miller stared, momentarily stunned. Then a slow grin spread across his face. "Yes, sir, Sheriff." He practically sprinted out the door towards the livery stable. Arthur strapped on his gun belt, checking the loads in his Colt Peacemaker with deliberate, steady hands. He didn't know what would happen when they confronted Rourke. He didn't know if he had the courage to see it through. But as he stepped out into the harsh sunlight, the star on his vest felt different. Not lighter, perhaps, but purposeful. He walked towards the livery, his stride longer, his gaze fixed straight ahead, ignoring the few curious townsfolk who stopped to watch him pass. For the first time in years, Sheriff Arthur Bishop wasn't just wearing the badge, he was heading out to try and earn it. Arthur and Ben Miller rode in silence towards the Double S Ranch, the tension stretching between them thick as trail dust. Arthur kept his face set, trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. The familiar landscape, the heat-baked rocks, the sparse vegetation clinging stubbornly to life, the vast indifferent sky, seemed alien today, charged with potential violence. He was acutely aware of the weight of the Colt at his hip, the coolness of its metal against his thigh. He hadn't drawn it in anger since the war. Could he? Would he, if it came down to it? They found Rourke and his men lounging near the newly erected Double S fence line that now cut brazenly across what had clearly been Ramirez's cultivated field. The trampled corn stalks lay broken and withered under the sun, a testament to their casual brutality. Rourke, a burly man with eyes like chips of obsidian and a scar bisecting one eyebrow, watched them approach, a smirk playing on his lips. His men shifted, hands hovering near their sidearms. "Well, well," Rourke drawled as Arthur and Ben reined in. "Looky here. Sheriff Bishop himself, gracing us with his presence. Lose your way?" His men chuckled appreciatively. Arthur swung down from his horse, moving with a deliberate slowness that surprised even himself. He met Rourke's insolent gaze squarely. "Rourke, you and your men assaulted Miguel Ramirez this morning, destroyed his property." Rourke spat into the dust. "Ramirez was trespassing. That fence he put up was on Mr. Stone's land. We just corrected his mistake. He resisted lawful action." "Lawful?" Arthur's voice was dangerously quiet. "Since when is beating a man near to death and trampling his livelihood lawful, Rourke?" Rourke's smirk faltered slightly at the sheriff's tone. He pushed himself away from the fence post he'd been leaning on. "Now you listen here, Sheriff. You ain't got no jurisdiction interfering in Mr. Stone's property disputes." Ramirez was warned. He didn't listen. "Maybe you should take that as a lesson yourself and ride on back to town before you get overheated." "I'm placing you under arrest, Rourke," Arthur stated, his voice level despite the tremor starting deep inside him, "for assault and destruction of property." Rourke stared at him, genuinely shocked for a moment, then burst out laughing. His men joined in, loud and mocking. "Arrest me? You? You ain't got the sand, Sheriff." "Never did." He took a step closer, his hand dropping towards his gun. "Now you and the boy get on your horses and ride out. This is your only warning." Time seemed to slow down. Arthur saw Ben Miller's hand tighten on his own weapon, saw the predatory glint in the eyes of Rourke's men as they fanned out slightly. This was it. The moment of truth. The fear surged, cold and paralyzing, threatening to swallow him whole. He could back down. He could find a reason. No one would be surprised. But then he saw, clear as day in his mind's eye, Miguel Ramirez's bruised face, Sarah Jenkins's blazing eyes, the star on his own vest. Does it mean anything at all? Something inside him snapped. The years of shame, of self-imposed paralysis, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard resolve. He didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he took another step towards Rourke, his gaze unwavering. I'm not asking you, Rourke. I'm telling you. You're coming with me. His voice had a new authority, a resonance that cut through the mocking laughter, silencing it. Rourke hesitated, thrown off balance by the sheriff's unexpected defiance. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by Bishop. His hand hovered over his gun, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. It was one of Rourke's men who broke the tension. A younger fella, eager to impress, drew his pistol. "He ain't going nowhere, Sheriff!" Ben Miller reacted instantly, his own gun clearing leather with surprising speed. "Don't try it." Before anyone else could move, Arthur acted on pure instinct, honed perhaps in those half-forgotten battles. He lunged forward, not for his gun, but for Rourke. He slammed his shoulder into the bigger man's chest, driving him backward, off balance. Rourke stumbled, his own draw disrupted. Arthur grabbed the foreman's gun arm, twisting it savagely. Rourke roared in pain and anger as his pistol clattered into the dust. Arthur followed through, using Rourke's momentum to throw him face down onto the hard-packed earth, landing heavily on his back, pinning him, wrenching his arms behind him. "Ben! Cover them!" Arthur yelled, his voice sharp, adrenaline singing through him. Miller, despite his youth, held steady, his pistol trained on the remaining men, who stood frozen, shocked by the sudden turn of events and their leader's swift incapacitation. Arthur hauled a struggling, cursing Rourke to his feet, shoving him towards Ben. "Get the cuffs on him, deputy." Rourke glared at Arthur, his face contorted with fury and humiliation. "You'll pay for this, Bishop. Stone will hear about this. He'll crucify you." "Maybe," Arthur said, breathing heavily, meeting Rourke's glare without flinching. "But today, you answer to the law." He looked at the other riders, his gaze hard. "Drop the gun belts," slowly. Hesitantly, seeing their leader subdued and Miller's unwavering aim, they complied, unbuckling their holsters and letting them fall. "Get on your horses," Arthur commanded. "Ride back to the Double S. Tell Stone his foreman's been arrested for assault. Tell him. Tell him Sheriff Bishop will be calling on him soon to discuss property lines and water rights." The men exchanged uneasy glances, then mounted up and rode off, leaving Arthur and Ben alone with their prisoner. Ben finished cuffing Rourke, looking at Arthur with newfound awe and respect. "Sheriff, Later, Ben," Arthur cut him off, though not unkindly. He felt strangely calm, the fear replaced by a clear, cold purpose. He had faced down Rourke, faced down his own paralysis. It was only the first step, he knew. Jedediah Stone was the real challenge, a far more dangerous adversary. But as he looked at the captured foreman, at the trampled field, at the vast, challenging landscape, Arthur felt something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of the man he used to be, the man he might still become. He had drawn a line in the dust, not with a gun, but with unexpected action. The question now was whether he had the strength to hold it. Getting Rourke back to the jail cell in Dust Devil Gulch created a stir, unlike anything the town had seen in years. People emerged from homes and businesses, staring in disbelief as Sheriff Bishop and Deputy Miller rode in, Stone's notorious foreman securely cuffed and slung ignominiously over his own horse. Whispers turned into excited murmurs. Flynn, the saloon owner, peered nervously through his swinging doors. Miller, the mercantile owner, actually cracked a cautious smile. Sarah Jenkins stepped out onto her porch, young Billy beside her, and watched them pass, her expression unreadable, but no longer filled with contempt. Arthur met her gaze briefly this time, offering a curt nod, which she returned after a moment's hesitation. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall of her disdain. Locking Rourke in the cell felt immensely satisfying, yet deeply unsettling. Arthur knew Stone wouldn't take this lying down. Retaliation would be swift and likely brutal. He had poked the hornet's nest. Now he had to prepare for the swarm. "Ben," Arthur said, turning to his deputy, whose eyes were still shining with adrenaline and admiration. "Go talk to Doc Evans. See if Miguel Ramirez is well enough to give a formal statement. And quietly, let folks know what happened. Let them know Rourke is in jail, but tell them to stay calm. No celebrations, not yet. This is far from over." "Yes, sir." Ben practically saluted and hurried off. Arthur sat down heavily at his desk, the adrenaline fading, leaving him weary but resolute. He needed a plan. Confronting Stone directly without more leverage was suicide. Rourke's arrest was a start, but Stone could likely buy his foreman's freedom with high-priced lawyers or sheer intimidation of witnesses. Arthur needed something more, something that struck at the heart of Stone's power. He thought about the property disputes, the water rights, Frank Jenkins's talk of prior claims before his accident. Could there be something in the official records? Deeds, surveys, water allocations filed years ago, before Stone's influence reached the territorial capital? It was a long shot. Those records were kept in Prescott, the territorial capital, a hard 3-day ride away. And Stone likely had eyes and ears even there. But Frank Jenkins had believed there was something amiss in the paperwork. Arthur himself had always dismissed it, too afraid or too apathetic to dig into complex legal matters that might antagonize Stone. Now, it seemed like the only viable path. He needed proof, something concrete to challenge Stone's seemingly unshakable position. He was contemplating the logistics, the risks, when Doc Evans came into the office. The old doctor looked tired, his shoulders slumped more than usual. "Arthur," he said, foregoing formalities, "came to tell you Miguel's statement is taken. Ben Miller witnessed it. Ramirez is hurting bad, couple of cracked ribs, internal bruising. But his spirit, well, seeing Rourke brought in seems to have done him more good than my bandages." He paused, peering at Arthur over his spectacles. "You finally did it, huh?" Stirred the pot. "Had to be done, Doc," Arthur said quietly. "Aye," Doc Evans nodded slowly. "But stirring ain't the same as cooking the stew, son. Jedediah Stone plays for keeps. Rourke is just muscle. Stone is the brain, cold and sharp as obsidian." He leaned closer. "Be careful, Arthur. Stone's got long tentacles, longer than most folks realize." "I know, Doc. I'm heading to Prescott tomorrow. See if I can find anything in the territorial records about Stone's original land claims, the water rights." Doc Evans raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Digging through dusty files while Stone sharpens his knives here? Risky." "Riskier to sit here and wait for him to make the next move," Arthur countered. "Ben can hold down the fort. Rourke's locked up tight. Stone won't make a move on the town directly while his foreman's our prisoner. Gives me a window." Doc Evans sighed. "Maybe. Just watch your back, Arthur, in Prescott, and especially when you get back." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Frank Jenkins. He'd be proud of you today." The door closed softly, leaving Arthur alone with the weight of the doc's warning and the unexpected warmth of his final words. The ride to Prescott was grueling, hot, and dusty. Arthur pushed himself and his horse, constantly scanning the horizon, feeling exposed, vulnerable. Every distant rider seemed like a potential threat sent by Stone. He slept little, eating jerky and hardtack, his mind racing, rehearsing what he would look for, how he would approach the clerks at the land office. He arrived in the bustling territorial capital feeling grimy, exhausted, and acutely aware of his isolation. The Territorial Land Registry Office was an imposing stone building, filled with clerks hunched over massive ledgers under flickering gaslights. Arthur, feeling out of place in his dusty trail clothes, approached the main counter. He explained his need to review the original surveys and water rights filings for the Devil Creek Valley, dating back 10 to 15 years. The chief clerk, a man with ink-stained fingers and an air of bureaucratic importance, looked him up and down skeptically. "Sheriff Bishop, you say? From Dust Devil Gulch?" He consulted a list. "Never heard of it." "It's a small settlement, sir," Arthur said patiently. "But the records should be under the county surveys." The clerk grumbled but eventually assigned a junior clerk to assist him, warning him not to disturb the archives unduly. Arthur spent the next 2 days immersed in a world of faded ink, brittle paper, and complex legal descriptions. He meticulously traced the history of land ownership in the valley, cross-referencing survey maps with water rights filings. It was slow, painstaking work. At first, everything seemed in order, confirming Stone's vast holdings, Legally acquired, it seemed. Doubt began to creep back in. Had Frank Jenkins been wrong? Was Arthur on a fool's errand? Then, late on the second day, deep in a dusty box of supplemental filings related to water rights adjustments from over a decade ago, he found it. A discrepancy. A faded survey map attached to an early water rights petition filed by one of the valley's original settlers, a man long since departed, showed the crucial spring, the one Frank Jenkins had died over, clearly situated outside the boundaries later claimed by Stone when he first acquired his large upstream parcel. Attached was a sworn affidavit regarding the spring's location and flow rate. But when Arthur cross-referenced this with Stone's initial land patent filing, the map accompanying Stone's claim was subtly different. The boundary line had been shifted, just slightly, incorporating the spring into Stone's property. The shift was minor, easily missed unless one compared the older, obscure survey directly. More damningly, the signature on the revised survey map accompanying Stone's patent, purportedly from the original territorial surveyor, looked off. The loops were different, the slant less consistent than on other documents bearing the same surveyor's name. Arthur felt a jolt, like lightning striking nearby. This was it. It wasn't just manipulation, it was potential fraud, right at the foundation of Stone's empire in the valley. That spring, and the land around it, likely never legally belonged to Stone in the first place. His entire claim to controlling the downstream water, the claim he used to strangle ranchers like Jenkins and Ramirez, might be based on a forged survey map attached to his original patent. His heart pounded. This was far bigger than Rourke's assault charge. This could unravel everything for Stone. He carefully requested certified copies of the older survey, the affidavit, and Stone's initial patent filing with its questionable map, citing his authority as sheriff investigating ongoing disputes. The junior clerk, oblivious to the significance, processed the request mechanically. As Arthur waited for the copies, clutching the potentially explosive evidence, a sudden, chilling thought struck him. How had Frank Jenkins known about this? Jenkins wasn't a man to pore over dusty legal files. Someone must have told him. Someone with access to these records, or knowledge of the original surveys. Who? And what had happened to them? The rock slide that killed Jenkins suddenly seemed even more sinister. Had he been silenced before he could bring this proof forward? And then came the twist, unexpected and chilling. As the clerk handed Arthur the certified copies, stamped and sealed, another man approached the counter. A well-dressed man with cold eyes Arthur vaguely recognized from wanted posters years ago, though never for anything provable. The man exchanged a few quiet words with the chief clerk, glancing briefly, dismissively at Arthur. The chief clerk nodded, then turned back to Arthur, his expression suddenly wary. "Sheriff," the chief clerk said, his voice strained. "There's been a query about your interest in these particular records. From Mr. Jedediah Stone's legal representatives here in Prescott, just confirming the nature of your official inquiry." Arthur felt ice prickle his spine. Stone knew. Somehow Stone already knew he was here, knew what he was looking for. Doc Evans's warning echoed. Stone's got long tentacles. His brief window of opportunity had just slammed shut. He had the evidence, but now Stone knew he had it. Getting back to Dust Devil Gulch alive with the documents intact had just become infinitely more dangerous. He tucked the precious copies inside his coat, offered a noncommittal reply to the clerk, and walked out of the land office, acutely aware of the hostile gaze following him down the street. The race was on. The ride back to Dust Devil Gulch was a blur of tension and exhaustion. Arthur pushed his horse relentlessly, deviating from the main trail, using canyons and ridges for cover, constantly watching his back trail. He felt hunted. Twice, he spotted riders in the distance, moving parallel to his course, too far away to identify but close enough to confirm his fears. Stone wasn't just waiting. He was actively trying to intercept him, to retrieve or destroy the evidence before Arthur could reach the relative safety of his own town. Safety? What safety could Dust Devil Gulch offer against a man like Stone, now alerted and likely enraged? He rode through the night, navigating by starlight, the precious documents buttoned securely inside his coat, a heavy weight against his chest. The fear was a constant companion, but it was different now. It wasn't the paralyzing fear of inaction, but the sharp, focused fear of a man with a mission, a man protecting something vital. He thought of the town, of Sarah, of Miguel, of Ben Miller holding the fort. He couldn't fail them now. He arrived on the outskirts of Dust Devil Gulch just as the first pale fingers of dawn were painting the eastern sky. The town looked quiet, asleep. But as he rode down the main street, he saw lights on in the sheriff's office. Ben Miller met him at the door, relief washing over his face, quickly replaced by concern as he saw Arthur's haggard appearance. "Sheriff, you made it. We were getting worried. Flynn, the saloon keeper, got a telegraph message yesterday, supposedly from Prescott asking about your whereabouts. Sounded fishy. I figured Stone was onto you." "He is, Ben," Arthur said grimly, dismounting stiffly. "He knows I have proof. Proof his original claim, the one controlling the water, might be based on fraud." He pulled out the certified copies, showing them briefly to the wide-eyed deputy. This could change everything. "Fraud?" Ben breathed, his eyes gleaming. "Then we got him." "Not yet," Arthur cautioned. "Knowing and proving are two different things, especially when Stone controls so much. And he won't let this evidence see the light of day if he can help it. He'll try to stop us, Ben. Here, in town." Just then, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the north end of town. Not just one or two riders, but a group, moving fast. "Looks like he's not wasting any time," Arthur said, his hand instinctively going to his Colt. He looked at Ben, saw the fear mixed with determination in the young man's eyes. "All right, deputy. Lock these documents in the safe, then get yourself ready. Looks like Mr. Stone decided to pay us a visit personally." Jedediah Stone rarely came down into Dust Devil Gulch himself. His arrival now, flanked by a dozen hard-faced riders, including the men Arthur had disarmed days earlier, signaled that the game had changed. They rode slowly down the main street, a wave of silent menace, stopping directly in front of the sheriff's office. The town, waking to the sound, went unnaturally still. Doors closed quietly. Faces peered nervously from behind curtains. Stone sat easily on his magnificent black horse, impeccably dressed despite the dust, his face calm, almost serene, but his eyes held the coldness of a winter sky. He surveyed the small office, his gaze lingering on the barred window where Rourke presumably watched, before settling on Arthur, who stood waiting on the boardwalk, Ben Miller a step behind him. "Sheriff Bishop." Stone's voice was smooth, cultured, carrying easily in the morning quiet. "An unexpected pleasure. I understand you've been traveling." "Official business, Mr. Stone," Arthur replied, keeping his voice steady. "Indeed," Stone smiled, a mere tightening of the lips. "My sources inform me your official business involved prying into matters that do not concern you. Specifically, my legally adjudicated land patents and water rights." "Those rights appear to be based on questionable surveys, Stone," Arthur stated bluntly, deciding pretense was useless. "I have certified copies from the territorial registry that suggest fraud." Stone's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Copies? Mere paper. Easily lost, easily misinterpreted, especially by a small-town sheriff perhaps exceeding his authority." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "I believe those papers belong to me, Sheriff, as evidence of your overreach. Hand them over, and we can perhaps discuss a reasonable severance package for your retirement. Persist, and I fear the consequences for this town, and for you personally, will be most unpleasant." It was a blatant threat, delivered with chilling nonchalance. Hand over the proof, betray the town, save his own skin, or stand his ground and face Stone's wrath. Arthur looked past Stone, at the scared faces peering from windows, at the dusty street where Frank Jenkins's blood might as well have stained the ground. He thought of the promise held in those documents, the promise of justice, of a future free from Stone's tyranny. The choice was clear, painfully, terrifyingly clear. Those documents are evidence in an official investigation, Stone, Arthur said, his voice ringing out, louder now, reaching the hidden listeners. They belong to the law, not to you, and they prove your claim to the valley's water is built on a lie. A lie? Stone chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Sheriff, in this territory, the truth is what I say it is, and I say you are obstructing my lawful business. Men, he addressed his riders, his voice dropping the facade, becoming sharp, commanding. Retrieve the documents, use necessary force, and bring the sheriff and his boy here to me. The riders tensed, hands moving towards their guns. Ben Miller drew his pistol, his knuckles white. Arthur stood his ground, his own hand hovering over his Colt. This was it. An uneven gunfight he couldn't possibly win. Stone had planned this, force a confrontation, kill the sheriff in self-defense, retrieve the papers, and claim legitimate authority. But before the first shot could be fired, another voice cut through the tension. Hold on there, Stone. Heads turned. Sarah Jenkins stood on the porch of her store, Tom's heavy rifle held steady in her hands, aimed not at Stone, but at the space just above his head. Beside her stood Doc Evans, holding an old shotgun awkwardly but resolutely. And emerging from alleys and doorways came others, Miguel Ramirez, limping but holding a rusty pistol, the blacksmith hefting his hammer, old Gus with an ancient buffalo gun, even Flynn the saloon keeper, pale but holding a scattergun. Not an army, but a dozen or so citizens, armed with desperation and a newfound flicker of courage ignited by their sheriff's stand. They formed a loose, determined line across the street, facing Stone's riders. "This is our town, Stone," Sarah called out, her voice clear and strong. "And that's our sheriff. You want those papers? You want him? You gotta come through us." Stone stared at the unexpected resistance, his composure finally cracking, his face darkening with fury. His riders shifted uneasily, their confidence shaken by the sight of armed, determined townspeople. A 12-2 fight was one thing. A potential bloodbath against determined citizens was another. Arthur felt a surge of fierce pride, of profound gratitude. He wasn't alone. His stand, his risky journey had meant something. It had rekindled the town's spirit. He seized the moment. "It's over, Stone," Arthur shouted, his voice resonating with authority. "Your fraud is exposed. These people know the truth. You have no power here anymore." He drew his Colt Peacemaker, not aiming at Stone, but holding it firmly, a symbol of the law he now embodied. "Ride out, Stone. Ride out now, before blood is shed that can't be washed away." Stone hesitated, his eyes darting between Arthur, his own hesitant men, and the determined line of townsfolk. He saw his control, built on fear and deception, crumbling before his eyes. He could order his men to fire, precipitate a massacre, but the cost, the repercussions in Prescott, once Arthur's evidence inevitably surfaced, would be too high. His calculating mind assessed the odds, the shifting balance of power. For the first time, Jedediah Stone had miscalculated. He had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit, underestimated the courage of a man pushed too far. With a snarl of pure hatred directed at Arthur, Stone yanked his horse's reins savagely. "This isn't over, Bishop," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. He wheeled his horse around. "Ride!" he commanded his men. Slowly, reluctantly, Stone's riders turned their horses, retreating back up the dusty street, leaving Dust Devil Gulch behind them. A collective sigh of relief, fragile and shaky, went through the assembled townspeople. They lowered their weapons, looking at each other, then at Arthur, with expressions of exhaustion, disbelief, and burgeoning hope. The immediate aftermath wasn't a celebration, but a quiet, sober stock-taking. Jedediah Stone was gone, for now, his power broken, his fraudulent claims exposed. Arthur, working with Ben and with help from Sarah Jenkins, who had a surprisingly sharp mind for details, prepared a formal case based on the documents from Prescott and the testimonies of Ramirez and others. They sent copies with a trusted messenger to the territorial marshal in Prescott, ensuring Stone couldn't simply make the problem disappear. Legal proceedings would follow, lengthy and complex, but the tide had turned irreversibly against the land baron. Dust Devil Gulch had taken its future back into its own hands. Rourke remained in jail, eventually convicted of assault, his sentence a clear message that Stone's impunity was over. The water flow in Devil Creek gradually returned to its natural course as Stone's unsupervised dams fell into disrepair or were cautiously dismantled by the ranchers downstream. The drought didn't magically end, but the water, lifeblood of the valley, was shared more equitably. Miguel Ramirez, aided by his neighbors, rebuilt his fence and slowly nursed his farm back to health. Sarah Jenkins's store saw more business as hope returned to the town. And Sheriff Arthur Bishop? He was a changed man. The haunted look in his eyes hadn't vanished entirely. The ghosts of Shiloh, the memory of his own past fear, were likely companions for life. But the shame was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence, a hard-won self-respect. He moved with purpose, spoke with authority, tempered by humility. He still carried the star, but now it felt earned, its weight familiar and right. The townspeople treated him with a respect that went deeper than mere politeness. It was the respect given to a man who had faced his own demons and emerged stronger, a man who had shown them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. He remained sheriff of Dust Devil Gulch, not just enforcing the law, but embodying its promise, working alongside the citizens to rebuild not just their town, but their trust in justice itself. He knew challenges remained, that the West was still a hard land, but he faced the future without flinching, ready for whatever the wind might bring. So you see, the measure of a man ain't taken when things are easy. It's taken when the pressure's on, when the fear is clawing at his throat. Arthur Bishop wore a star long before he earned the right to it. He was tangled in his past, paralyzed by fear, letting injustice fester right under his nose. Many would have written him off, maybe rightly so. But somewhere deep inside, that spark of duty, that ember of courage, hadn't been entirely extinguished. Pushed to the brink, faced with the undeniable consequences of his own inaction, he found the strength to stand up, not just to a ruthless tyrant, but to the fear that had held him captive for so long. His redemption wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, hard-fought, and profoundly real. It reminds us that it's never too late to change course, to find your courage, to make that star on your chest, or the principles in your heart, actually mean something. It teaches us that even in the dustiest, most forgotten corners of the world, one person choosing to do the right thing, however afraid they might be, can ignite the spirit of a whole community and bring about a justice that seemed impossible. True strength, you see, isn't never being afraid. It's saddling up anyway. Think about that. Think about the shadows we all carry, and the courage it takes to step out into the light. If this story of redemption on the frontier struck a chord with you, share it. Let others hear about the sheriff who found his nerve when it mattered most. What does courage look like to you? Is redemption always possible? Let us know your thoughts down below. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the heart of the American West. Stories of hardship and hope that remind us of the enduring strength of the human spirit. 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 Strength of the human spirit.